Minutes before his wedding, a billionaire abandoned his bride for his mistress. The scandal exploded when DNA results revealed his mistress was actually his niece, given up for adoption by his sister years ago. His impulsive decision exposed family secrets that cost him everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The air hung heavy with the scent of lilies and unspoken anxieties. Crystal chandeliers glittered, reflecting the nervous energy radiating from the assembled guests. Julian Thorne, in his impeccably tailored tuxedo, felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He adjusted his cufflinks, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning heat in his chest. Isabella, radiant in her designer gown, smiled serenely, a picture of poised perfection. But Julian saw past the facade, sensing the subtle tremor in her hand as she clasped his. His gaze drifted to the champagne flute in his hand, the bubbly liquid mirroring the turmoil within. "Ready," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted chatter. Her breath hitched slightly, a vulnerability that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. Julian forced a smile, the gesture feeling strained and unnatural. "As I'll ever be," he replied, the words hollow even to his own ears. He knew it was a lie, a cruel performance played for an audience that deserved more honesty. The truth, a tangled mess of illicit desires and simmering resentments, felt too heavy to bear. He saw Ava in the crowd, her fiery red dress a beacon in the sea of pastels. Her eyes locked onto him, a silent promise hanging between them. The weight of his impending betrayal pressed down, a suffocating burden threatening to crush him. The organ music swelled, a prelude to a ceremony he was about to desecrate. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of impending doom. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a web of his own making. The organ music swelled, a wave of sound that threatened to drown out the frantic hammering of Julian's heart. He felt trapped, a gilded bird in a cage of his own design. Isabella's hand, trembling slightly in his, felt like a fragile porcelain doll, easily shattered. He squeezed it gently, a pathetic attempt at reassurance, even to himself. "You look pale," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the mounting crescendo of the music. Her eyes, usually sparkling with ambition, held a vulnerability that pierced his carefully constructed armor. He saw a flicker of fear, a tiny crack in her perfectly composed facade. And in that moment, the weight of his impending betrayal doubled. He forced a smile, a grotesque parody of his usual charm. "Nerves," he mumbled, his voice a rasp. The champagne, barely touched, felt like acid on his tongue. The taste of deceit was already bitter. Ava's fiery gaze across the room felt like a brand. Her red dress, a defiant splash of color in the pastel sea of wedding guests, pulsed with a silent promise. He saw the hunger in her eyes, the same desperate need that gnawed at his own soul, a need for something real, something beyond the gilded cage of his existence. The priest's voice boomed, a jarring intrusion into Julian's internal turmoil. The words, "promises of forever," felt like a cruel joke. He looked at Isabella again, her serene smile now a mask of heartbreaking fragility. He saw not just a bride, but a woman whose trust he was about to shatter. The guilt clawed at him, a sharp, physical pain. He stole another glance at Ava, her expression unreadable, but a subtle tremor in her hand betrayed her own anxieties. Their connection, once so vibrant and exciting, now felt like a poisoned chalice. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his impulsive leap into passion was about to crash down around him, taking everything and everyone with it. The weight of his decision, the monumental scale of his betrayal, threatened to suffocate him. The wedding, the opulent setting, the expectant guests all faded into a blurry, indistinct background as he stared into the abyss of his own making. The next few moments would irrevocably change the course of his life and the lives of everyone he held dear. The music swelled, a prelude to the chaos that was about to erupt. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, hung in the air, a suffocating perfume mirroring the suffocating pressure Julian felt. He watched Isabella, her smile a fragile mask barely concealing the tremor in her hand. The opulent ballroom, a testament to his wealth, felt like a gilded prison. He should feel elated, the culmination of years of planning, yet a cold dread gnawed at his insides. "You all right, darling?" Isabella's voice, usually crisp and controlled, held a fragile sweetness that tugged at something deep within him, something he desperately tried to ignore. He forced a smile, the gesture feeling as hollow as the promises he was about to break. "Perfectly," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His gaze drifted to Ava, across the room, her fiery red dress a stark contrast to the pastel elegance surrounding them. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of desperate longing and unspoken guilt. The priest's voice began the ceremony, a droning monotone that seemed to amplify the turmoil within Julian. Each word, each solemn vow, felt like a hammer blow against his already fractured conscience. He saw the genuine joy on Isabella's face, the trusting innocence in her eyes, and the weight of his deception crushed him. The champagne he'd sipped earlier burned a bitter path down his throat. He could almost taste the coming ruin. Ava's subtle shift, a barely perceptible adjustment of her posture, spoke volumes. The carefree facade she usually projected had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored his own. The vibrant energy that had drawn him to her now felt brittle, fragile, like a priceless vase teetering on the edge of destruction. The music swelled, a crescendo of impending doom. He stole another look at Isabella, the serene smile now a mask of heartbreaking fragility. He had to choose. He had to end this agonizing torment, even if it meant shattering everything he possessed. The decision, once a seductive whisper, had become a deafening roar. He knew, with chilling certainty, that this was the moment everything would irrevocably change. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect celebration. The weight of his impending actions pressed down on him, an unbearable burden. The champagne flutes felt icy against Julian's sweating palms. The scent of lilies, roses, and something subtly acrid, perhaps the faintest whiff of Ava's perfume, filled the opulent ballroom. He stole another glance at Isabella, her radiant smile a carefully constructed facade. He knew the tremor in her hand, the barely perceptible tightening of her jaw, were signs of her own burgeoning anxiety. He should be feeling joy, the culmination of years of careful planning, but a cold dread, sharp as shards of glass, filled him. "You seem pensive," Isabella said, her voice a silken whisper that belied the steel in her spine. She squeezed his hand, her touch oddly cold. He forced a smile, a rictus of strained muscles that did little to mask the turmoil within. "Just admiring the artistry," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely towards the breathtaking floral arrangements that adorned the hall. The words felt hollow, empty pronouncements devoid of meaning. His gaze drifted back to Ava, her fiery red dress a beacon in the sea of pastel elegance. Their eyes locked again, a silent, agonizing conversation passing between them. He saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a fleeting vulnerability that belied her carefully cultivated air of confidence. The passionate intensity of their clandestine meetings now felt brittle, fragile, like a delicate porcelain doll poised on the brink of shattering. The music swelled, a rich, romantic melody that sounded eerily discordant against the discord within him. He thought of Clara, his sister, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. He'd always felt a simmering resentment towards her, towards the expectations she and his family placed upon him, the life they had meticulously crafted for him. He wondered if she knew about Ava, if she sensed the monumental deceit he was about to perpetrate. A wave of nausea threatened to engulf him. The priest's voice boomed, the solemn pronouncements echoing the turmoil within Julian's soul. Each word, each vow, felt like a hammer blow against his already fractured conscience. He saw the genuine happiness radiating from Isabella, the unquestioning trust in her eyes, and the weight of his impending betrayal became unbearable. He could feel the eyes of his family upon him, judging, expectant. Their silence was more damning than any accusation. He was trapped, ensnared by his own making, caught in a web of lies and deceit. This gilded cage had become a suffocating tomb. The moment of decision loomed, a precipice from which there was no turning back. He had to choose. He had to act. The roar in his ears drowned out the music, the priest's voice, Isabella's soft breathing. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the catastrophic consequences. The storm was about to break. Ava traced the rim of her champagne flute, the crystal cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the fiery heat simmering beneath her surface. The opulent ballroom shimmered, a dizzying kaleidoscope of silk and jewels, but the dazzling spectacle felt strangely distant. Julian, across the room, seemed a million miles away, lost in a storm of his own making. He'd stolen glances at her throughout the evening, each a silent, desperate plea for reassurance. But tonight, even the potent elixir of their forbidden love felt diluted, tainted by a growing unease. "He's going to do it, isn't he?" A soft voice whispered beside her. It was Vivian, a longtime friend, her usual breezy confidence replaced by a worried frown. Ava shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Do what? Marry Isabella?" The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Vivian's gaze was sharp, piercing. "No, leave her. For you." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've seen it in his eyes, Ava. That look of desperation. He's terrified." The observation struck a chord. Beneath Julian's bravado, his relentless pursuit, she'd sensed a deep-seated fear, a crippling insecurity that mirrored her own. Their connection, born of mutual vulnerability, was now a fragile raft in a turbulent sea. "Maybe he's just nervous," Ava murmured, but even to her own ears, the words sounded unconvincing. The champagne tasted bitter, the music too loud, the shimmering ballroom suddenly oppressive. The weight of her secret pressed down on her, a crushing burden. The thought of Julian discovering the truth, the shattering impact on both their lives, was a horrifying prospect. Their clandestine meetings, the stolen moments of passion, now felt like a betrayal not only of Isabella, but of herself. She felt a deep, gnawing guilt that threatened to consume her. The vibrant red of her dress seemed to mock her, a bold statement of defiance in the face of impending doom. The mask of confidence she'd carefully constructed began to crack, revealing the terrified, vulnerable woman beneath. The storm was indeed brewing, and it threatened to engulf them all. The weight of Vivian's words settled heavily on Ava. The opulent ballroom, once a stage for her carefully constructed illusion of happiness, now felt like a suffocating cage. The clinking of champagne flutes, the murmur of polite conversation, all sounded muffled, distant, as if heard through a thick layer of cotton wool. Julian, across the room, looked smaller, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that throbbed in the air between them. He caught her eye. A flicker of desperation, a silent plea, passed between them. The shared secret, the intoxicating danger of their affair, suddenly felt heavy with consequence. The vibrant red of her dress, once a symbol of defiance, now felt like a scarlet brand. "He's going to do it?" Vivian repeated, her voice low, a tremor of foreboding in her tone. "Leave Isabella. For you." Ava couldn't deny it. The truth, like a poisonous vine, was strangling her. The thrill of their forbidden love, the heady rush of breaking societal norms, now felt nauseating. The bitter taste of champagne lingered on her tongue, a harsh reminder of the emptiness at the core of their passionate, yet shallow, connection. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cheek. The carefully applied mascara smudged, a visible crack in her flawless facade. She felt a deep, primal fear, a chilling premonition of the impending storm. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real life with real consequences. And the consequences were about to shatter everything. The music swelled, a dramatic crescendo that mirrored the turmoil within her. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock her with their cold, indifferent light. The gilded cage had sprung its trap, and she was caught. The weight of her secret, the deception, the potential ruin of everything. It threatened to suffocate her. Julian, oblivious to her internal struggle, continued his agonizing dance with fate. The clock was ticking. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching. The champagne flute felt cold against Ava's trembling fingers. The music, a swirling waltz, felt discordant, a mocking soundtrack to her impending doom. Julian, a distant figure across the ballroom, was lost in conversation with his father, his face etched with a familiar mask of controlled intensity. But Ava saw beneath the surface, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured. He knew she knew. Vivian's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, he's going to do it. Leave Isabella. For you. Asterisk, the thought was a physical blow, each syllable a hammer against her ribs. The weight of it, the enormity of the decision about to be made, crushed her. The carefully constructed facade, the glamorous exterior, was crumbling. She caught his eye again. This time, there was no desperation, only a chilling resignation in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice they stood upon. He looked away, the brief connection severed as brutally as a snapped thread. Ava, a soft voice broke through her turmoil. It was Isabella, her bride-to-be, a vision in shimmering silk. Her smile was perfect, flawless, but her eyes held a haunting emptiness. Ava forced a smile, a pale imitation of her usual dazzling radiance. Isabella, she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella approached, her movements graceful, almost ethereal. Close up. The carefully applied makeup couldn't quite hide the faint lines of worry around her eyes. You look pensive, Isabella observed, her tone carefully neutral. There was a polite distance in her voice, a subtle shift, a subtle awareness. Ava wondered if Isabella suspected, if the carefully crafted illusion was already cracking for her as well. Ava swallowed, the dryness in her throat a physical manifestation of her fear. Just a little overwhelmed, she managed, her voice shaky. It's all so much. Isabella nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Yes, she agreed softly. It is. Then, with a serene smile that belied the turmoil within, she added, but soon it will all be over, and we will be married. The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Ava knew, with a dreadful certainty, that Isabella's prediction would not come to pass. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second a step closer to the inevitable implosion. The gilded cage was about to collapse, and Ava, along with Julian, would be buried beneath the ruins. The air hung heavy with the scent of lilies and unspoken anxieties. Ava, perched on a plush velvet chaise lounge, felt the silk cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the fire simmering beneath her carefully composed exterior. Julian's absence was a palpable thing, a void in the opulent ballroom that mirrored the emptiness growing within her. The champagne, usually a source of effervescent joy, tasted flat and bitter. A waiter approached, his white-gloved hand hovering over a crystal flute. More champagne, mademoiselle? He asked, his voice a hushed murmur in the otherwise vibrant room. Ava shook her head, the movement too abrupt. No, thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted chatter. The music, a Strauss waltz, seemed to mock her inner turmoil, its elegant melody a stark contrast to the chaos brewing within. Her eyes drifted to the massive French doors, their dark wood a silent sentinel guarding the garden beyond. The thought of escape, of fleeing this suffocating atmosphere, was a siren's call, but fear held her captive. The impending revelation, the truth hanging over them like a guillotine blade, paralyzed her. A soft touch on her arm jolted her back to reality. Isabella stood beside her, her wedding dress a breathtaking cascade of ivory silk. Yet, Ava saw the strain beneath the flawless composure, the tremor in her carefully controlled smile. You seem troubled, Ava? Isabella said, her voice a low, carefully modulated tone. There was no accusation, only a quiet observation. A woman assessing a situation with unsettling calm. Ava forced a smile, a brittle, unconvincing mask. "Just overwhelmed," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's all so much." Isabella nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Indeed," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She paused and then added with a chilling calm that sent shivers down Ava's spine. "But soon, it will all be over, and you will be alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. The unspoken truth hung between them, thick and suffocating. The waltz music swelled, its vibrant notes a stark contrast to the impending storm. Ava knew with a dreadful certainty the storm was about to break. The heavy oak door to the library creaked shut, the sound swallowed by the hushed opulence of the room. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass windows, painted swirling patterns on the Persian rug. Julian sank into a leather armchair, the worn leather yielding under his weight, offering no comfort to the turmoil within. The scent of old books and polished wood did little to soothe his racing heart. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the weight of his impending decision pressing down like a physical burden. A framed photograph on the desk caught his eye, a younger Julian, beaming, standing beside a vibrant, laughing Clara. The memory, sharp and painful, pierced through the fog of his anxieties. He remembered Clara's bright eyes, her infectious laughter, a stark contrast to the brittle, resentful woman she'd become. Their relationship, once a source of joy, had fractured under the weight of unspoken resentments and unhealed wounds. His father's expectations, the suffocating pressure of the Thorne legacy, had driven a wedge between them. He'd always felt suffocated by his family's expectations, the pressure to maintain their pristine image. Now the weight threatened to crush him. A sigh escaped his lips, a ragged sound lost in the cavernous silence of the library. He picked up a silver cigarette case, the cool metal a momentary solace against the burning anxiety in his chest. He lit a cigarette, the familiar ritual offering a fleeting sense of control in this chaotic maelstrom. The smoke curled around his face, obscuring his features, mirroring the confusion swirling within. He thought of Ava, her vibrant energy, her intoxicating allure, her laughter, usually a melody that could chase away the shadows, now seemed hollow, a mocking reminder of his impending betrayal. He knew he was making a mistake, colossal, devastating mistake. He was about to throw away everything, his fortune, his reputation, his family, for a woman who, he now recognized with a cold dread, was not the woman he thought she was. The truth, a chilling premonition he couldn't quite grasp, hung heavy in the air, as thick and suffocating as the smoke from his cigarette. The wedding loomed, a monstrous specter threatening to consume him entirely. The weight of his family's expectations, the crushing weight of his own desires, combined to form an unbearable pressure, threatening to shatter him. The only certainty, this decision, whatever it might be, would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The champagne flute felt icy against Julian's trembling fingers. The laughter of the guests, a muffled roar from beyond the French doors, sounded distant, unreal. He watched Isabella from across the opulent ballroom, a vision in shimmering silk, oblivious to the storm raging within him. Her smile, usually so dazzling, seemed brittle, strained. He'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, the practiced ease of a seasoned actor. But the script had disintegrated. He stole a glance at his watch. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until he was supposed to walk down the aisle, pledge his life to a woman he barely knew, a woman whose ambition shone brighter than any genuine affection. The scent of lilies, intended to be romantic, felt suffocating. Ava's image flashed in his mind, her fiery hair, the mischievous glint in her eyes, the way she laughed, a sound that once filled him with a reckless joy. Now, that joy felt tainted, shadowed by a chilling uncertainty. He'd always chased fleeting sensations, seeking escape from the stifling expectations of his family. Ava represented that escape, a rebellion against the gilded cage he'd been born into. But the thrill had waned, replaced by a gnawing unease. He whispered, "I can't do this." The words lost in the symphony of clinking glasses and polite chatter. His reflection in a nearby mirror showed a stranger eyes dark with turmoil, lips pressed into a grim line. The weight of his decision threatened to crush him. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the suffocating dread that had plagued him since childhood. He needed air, needed to escape the suffocating opulence, the suffocating expectations. He excused himself to a nearby balcony, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. Below, the city lights twinkled, a mesmerizing display of artificial brilliance. But even this spectacle couldn't distract him from the looming crisis. He was about to sacrifice everything, his reputation, his fortune, his family's legacy, for a love that felt increasingly hollow, and a terrifying question echoed in his mind. What if Ava wasn't who he thought she was? The thought was a chilling premonition, a harbinger of the catastrophic truth that awaited him. His impulsive decision was teetering on the precipice, about to plunge him into an abyss from which there might be no return. The balcony offered a breathtaking view, but Julian saw nothing. The city lights blurred into a chaotic smear, mirroring the turmoil within him. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. He felt trapped, suffocated by the opulence of his own life. "It's not just about Ava," he murmured, the words lost to the wind. "It's about everything." A wave of nausea hit him, the champagne he'd forced down earlier churning in his stomach. He leaned against the cold stone balustrade, the chill seeping into his bones. The weight of his family's expectations, the suffocating pressure of their legacy, pressed down on him. He'd always felt like an outsider looking in, a gilded prisoner in his own life. He thought of Clara, his sister, her face etched with a sadness he'd never understood, always kept at arm's length by a wall of his own making. His relationship with her was a tapestry woven with unspoken resentments and bitter silences, a constant source of internal conflict. A sudden memory flashed. Clara, young, vibrant, laughing, her eyes filled with a light that had long since faded. The image was shattered by the memory of their last conversation, a bitter argument filled with accusations and recriminations. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the cacophony of the wedding preparations. He could hear Isabella's voice, faint but clear, a melodic sound that now felt like a mockingbird's song, cruelly cheerful. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to destroy everything, his reputation, his family, for a love that seemed increasingly fragile, increasingly suspect. He opened his eyes, his gaze settling on a single flickering light in the distance. It represented something real, something that defied the artificiality of his life. A flicker of hope, or perhaps a chilling premonition. The question echoed again, sharper now. Was Ava truly the escape he sought, or the beginning of his ruin? The weight of his decision threatened to break him. He had 10 minutes left to decide. 10 minutes to choose between a life predetermined and one fraught with unknown consequences. 10 minutes that could determine everything. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a hammer blow against Julian's already fractured composure. He paced the opulent bridal suite, the plush carpet muffling his steps, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. The scent of lilies, meant to be intoxicating, now felt cloying, suffocating. He could almost taste the bitterness of unshed tears. He stopped before the sprawling window, the city sprawling beneath him like a glittering, indifferent beast. Below, the wedding preparations continued, a frantic ballet of activity unseen, unheard by him. He was adrift, disconnected from the orchestrated chaos of his own making. "Julian," Isabella's voice, soft and hesitant, cut through the suffocating silence. He turned, her reflection mirrored in the glass, her face a mask of fragile hope, unaware of the impending devastation. He saw his own reflection there too, a stranger in his own skin, haunted and hollow-eyed. He approached her slowly, the silk of his tuxedo a strange comfort against the tremor in his hands. "Isabella," he began, his voice a mere whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. He couldn't meet her eyes, the guilt already heavy in his chest. "Is something wrong?" Her voice trembled, a delicate porcelain vase teetering on the edge of destruction. He saw the unshed tears welling in her eyes, mirrored by the unshed tears within himself. The irony was brutal. He was about to shatter the life she had envisioned, a life he had helped create, a life he now found himself incapable of sustaining. He wanted to tell her the truth, confess his cowardice, his selfish desires, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, choked by the weight of his impending betrayal. The silence stretched, a taut elastic band threatening to snap. The image of Ava, radiant and untamed, flashed in his mind, a cruel contrast to Isabella's composed fragility. He was trapped between the gilded cage of his family's expectations and the seductive allure of a love that felt both thrilling and terrifyingly wrong. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was choosing destruction. The clock ticked on, each second bringing him closer to the precipice, closer to the inevitable unraveling. The weight of his decision, his life, bore down on him. The opulent room felt like a tomb, suffocating him in its gilded splendor. He had 10 minutes left, and every second felt like an eternity. The church bells, a distant, muffled toll, seemed to mock Julian's internal turmoil. He stood rigid, the weight of his tuxedo a physical manifestation of the crushing responsibility he felt. The scent of lilies and old wood filled the air, a suffocating sweetness that mirrored the nauseating sweetness of his lie. Isabella, radiant in her gown, was a vision of breathtaking beauty, her smile a fragile mask barely concealing the nervous flutter in her hands. He watched her, a silent observer of her oblivious happiness, the chasm between them widening with every passing second. A nervous cough from his best man, a fleeting glimpse of his father's disapproving frown. All were details he registered without truly absorbing. His focus remained relentlessly on Ava, a vision of fiery defiance in a crimson dress, sitting several rows back, her eyes locked on him, radiating a silent challenge and a dangerous promise. He opened his mouth to speak, to utter the vows he'd rehearsed countless times, but the words caught in his throat, a choked sob threatening to escape. He felt Isabella's hand gently brush his. Her touch, usually a source of distant comfort, now felt like a burning brand, a constant reminder of the betrayal he was about to commit. "Julian," her voice, soft as a summer breeze, yet trembling with barely contained anxiety, pierced through the haze of his inner conflict. He looked down at her, at the delicate tremor of her fingers interlaced with his. He saw the reflection of his own conflicted soul in her wide, trusting eyes. The guilt was a physical weight crushing him. He forced a weak smile. I'm fine, Isabella." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. The organ music swelled, a prelude to the final act of his charade. He felt a cold dread, a premonition of the storm that would break upon his life, a storm far worse than the impending marital vows. He closed his eyes, trying to find some anchor in the storm within him, but the only thing he found was Ava's face, a siren's call luring him towards his destruction. The weight of his decision, the irrevocable choice he was about to make, hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, like the scent of those damnable lilies. The organ music swelled, a wave of sound threatening to drown him. Julian felt a clammy sweat slicking his palms, the expensive silk of his cufflinks suddenly abrasive against his skin. Isabella's hand, small and trembling in his, sent a jolt of guilt through him, a sharp counterpoint to the burning desire that still pulsed for Ava. He stole a glance at her, a flash of crimson in the sea of pastel dresses, and the wave of desire threatened to pull him under. "Julian," Isabella's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the music. Her breath hitched, a small, vulnerable sound that should have anchored him, should have solidified his resolve to go through with this charade. Instead, it only intensified the conflict raging within him. He squeezed her hand, the gesture feeling hollow, devoid of genuine affection. "I'm fine," he lied, the words tasting like bitter ashes on his tongue. The lie, like a poisoned dart, struck at the fragile peace he'd been clinging to. The priest began the vows, his words a droning backdrop to the turmoil in Julian's heart. He watched Isabella, her radiant smile now strained, a thin crack appearing in the flawless facade she presented to the world. He saw the adoration in her eyes, the unwavering belief in their future, a future he was about to shatter. He could almost feel Ava's gaze burning into him, a silent promise, a dangerous invitation to plunge into the abyss. The scent of lilies, so cloyingly sweet moments before, now felt suffocating, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the nauseating sweetness of his carefully constructed lies. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, heavy as a tombstone. He was trapped, suspended between two worlds, his heart torn in two. One path led to a gilded cage of societal expectations, the other to a fiery embrace of forbidden desire. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that whichever path he chose would lead to ruin. The choice, however, was his to make. And as the priest's voice rose to pronounce the sacred words, Julian made his fatal decision. He would abandon everything for Ava. His heart, fractured and broken, felt cold as ice, yet simultaneously hot with fevered desire. This was his doom. He would embrace it. With a choked sob, Isabella's carefully constructed composure crumbled. The music, once a celebratory fanfare, now felt like a mocking dirge. Julian, watching her face crumple, felt a pang of something akin to guilt, a fleeting shadow quickly eclipsed by the incandescent pull of Ava. He saw Ava, radiant in crimson, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anticipation and something else, a dark, unsettling hunger. The priest's voice, a monotonous drone, echoed in the cavernous cathedral. "Do you, Julian, take Isabella?" The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Julian's throat constricted. He opened his mouth to speak, to utter the words that would seal his fate, but no sound emerged. He felt paralyzed, caught between the suffocating weight of expectation and the intoxicating allure of forbidden desire. Isabella's hand, still clasped in his, trembled violently. He felt the tremor resonate through his own body, a physical manifestation of the turmoil ripping through him. He squeezed her hand, a hollow gesture devoid of genuine comfort. The touch felt alien, a stark contrast to the electric thrill Ava's mere presence ignited within him. The scent of lilies, once delightful, now filled him with a nauseating sweetness. Each petal seemed to mock his impending betrayal. He glanced at Ava again, her lips curved into a silent, knowing smile. It was a smile that promised adventure, excitement, a release from the gilded cage of his life. But it was also a smile that whispered of ruin, of a future shrouded in shadows. He saw his reflection in Isabella's tear-filled eyes, a stranger staring back at him, a man consumed by selfish desires, a man willing to sacrifice everything for a fleeting moment of passion. The weight of his decision, the monumental consequences of his actions crashed down upon him, crushing him under their immense weight. He was a prisoner of his own making, trapped between a life of societal expectations and the intoxicating allure of forbidden love. The priest's voice continued, the words blurring into an indistinguishable hum. But Julian heard nothing. He saw only Ava, her crimson dress a fiery beacon in the sea of pastel, beckoning him towards the abyss. The choice was made, his fate sealed. He would leave. He would leave Isabella, his bride, at the altar. The organ music swelled, a suffocating wave of sound in the opulent cathedral. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished marble floor. Isabella, breathtaking in her ivory gown, looked serene, a porcelain doll poised on the precipice of forever. But Julian saw the subtle tremor in her hand, the barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. He knew the carefully constructed facade was cracking. He felt the same cracks spreading within himself, a spiderweb of doubt and fear. He squeezed Isabella's hand, a feeble attempt at reassurance, But the gesture felt hollow, a performance for the assembled guests rather than a genuine expression of love. Ava's image, vibrant and defiant, flashed in his mind, eclipsing Isabella's delicate beauty. The priest's voice, a comforting baritone, began the vows. Each word was a hammer blow to Julian's already fracturing resolve. He should be happy, he told himself. This was the culmination of years of careful planning, the fulfillment of his family's expectations. But a deep, gnawing emptiness gnawed at his soul. He glanced at Ava, seated amongst the guests, a scarlet splash of defiance in the sea of pastel. Their eyes met, a silent, conspiratorial exchange. The fiery intensity in her gaze fueled his already raging internal conflict. He saw not love in her eyes, but something else, a reckless thrill, a shared understanding of rebellion. Isabella's voice, soft yet clear, echoed through the cathedral. Julian barely heard the words. A roaring in his ears drowned out the vows, the music, even his own thoughts. He was trapped between two worlds, between the life he was expected to live and the intoxicating, destructive path he so desperately craved. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavier than any crown he had ever worn. The choice wasn't between two women. It was between a gilded cage and the unknown, a life of societal expectation and the exhilarating risk of shattering everything. He felt the cold sweat prickling his skin. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped his lips. The priest paused, his brow furrowed in concern. The silence, thick and suffocating, stretched, amplifying the turmoil within Julian. His world narrowed to the intense gaze of Ava, a beacon in the approaching storm. He knew with a sickening certainty what he had to do. The cathedral doors slammed shut behind Julian, the echoing sound a stark counterpoint to the stunned silence inside. Isabella stood, a fragile figure in her ivory gown, a single tear tracing a path down her flawless cheek. The whispered gasps of the assembled guests felt like a physical blow. Julian didn't look back. He pushed through the throng of shocked faces, their expressions a kaleidoscope of disbelief and scorn. He could feel the weight of their judgment, a crushing burden added to the already immense guilt that clawed at his insides. Ava, a whirlwind of scarlet silk and defiant energy just moments before, now sat frozen, her vibrant facade crumbling before his eyes. The triumphant glint in her eyes was replaced by a dawning horror. He saw a flicker of regret, a fleeting glimpse of the woman beneath the mask of reckless abandon. He wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, some apology, but the words caught in his throat. The opulent ballroom, moments before a scene of extravagant celebration, now felt like a tomb. The champagne flutes sat untouched. The exquisite floral arrangements seemed to wilt under the sudden pall of despair. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, felt suffocating. Julian stumbled through the deserted corridors of the Thorne mansion, the grandeur of his surroundings mocking his inner turmoil. The polished marble floor reflected his haggard face, highlighting the lines of stress etched around his eyes. Each step echoed the deafening silence of his self-imposed isolation. He found himself collapsing onto a plush velvet chaise lounge in his study, the heavy weight of his decisions crushing him. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, a relentless reminder of the time slipping away, the irreversible nature of his actions. He felt a raw, visceral pain, a mixture of regret, shame, and a terrifying uncertainty about the future. The gilded cage had indeed shattered, but the freedom he craved felt more like a terrifying plunge into the abyss. He buried his face in his hands, the luxurious silk offering no comfort. The weight of his betrayal, the magnitude of his mistake, was more than he could bear. The glittering facade of his life had crumbled, leaving behind only the raw, brutal truth of his selfishness. The news exploded. Headlines screamed of Julian Thorne's scandalous desertion, the jilted bride, the mysterious mistress. Isabella, pale and composed even in her devastation, granted a single, heartbroken interview, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of her shattered dreams. The public devoured the story, a ravenous beast feasting on the downfall of a titan. Ava, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a gilded cage of a different kind. The initial thrill of her victory curdled into a nauseating fear. Julian's sprawling mansion, once a symbol of her triumph, now felt like a prison. The opulent furnishings, the lavish art, mocked her with their cold indifference. She paced her vast bedroom, the silk sheets whispering against her bare feet, unable to find solace in the luxury she had so desperately craved. "He'll come back," she whispered, the words a fragile shield against the rising tide of dread. But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The silence of the phone, the absence of his frantic calls, screamed a truth she refused to acknowledge. The champagne bubbles in her crystal glass seemed to mirror the effervescent, yet ultimately hollow, nature of their affair. A frantic knock shattered the silence. Clara, Julian's sister, stood in the doorway, her face a mask of fury and grief. Her eyes, usually warm and kind, burned with a cold fire. "You," she breathed, her voice raw with pain. "You are the reason my brother has destroyed his life." Ava flinched but met Clara's gaze. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she stammered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tremor in her voice, the raw vulnerability in her eyes. The truth, like a bitter poison, was beginning to seep into her very being. The weight of her actions, the magnitude of her betrayal, pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. The gilded cage had indeed imploded, and she was left exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. The shattering of illusions extended far beyond Julian's fall. It had brought down her carefully constructed world as well. The news reporters outside, clamoring for answers, were a distant, almost irrelevant drone. The real storm raged within her own heart. The mahogany door of Julian's penthouse suite slammed shut, echoing the thunderous crash of his reputation. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of expensive champagne and the lingering ghost of unspoken promises. Isabella's wedding dress, abandoned on a plush velvet chaise lounge, seemed to mock him with its pristine perfection, a stark contrast to the wreckage of his life. He stared at it, a wave of nausea washing over him. The opulence that once defined him now felt suffocating, a gilded cage of his own making. Ava, pale and trembling, sat on the edge of the bed, her usual vibrant energy extinguished. The silk sheets, once symbols of passion, now felt like a shroud. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic drumming of her heart. "What do we do?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the discarded gown. The enormity of his actions hit him with the force of a physical blow. He traded a life of carefully constructed stability for a fleeting moment of passion, a passion now revealed to be twisted, forbidden. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. The phone buzzed, a relentless, shrill intrusion. He ignored it, the ringing a constant reminder of the world outside, a world that now viewed him with contempt and disgust. The once adoring gaze of the paparazzi now held only disdain. His carefully constructed empire, built on ambition and ruthlessness, was crumbling before his eyes. Ava reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against his arm. "Julian," she repeated, her voice laced with fear. "Please say something." He turned, his eyes meeting hers, but seeing nothing but the reflection of his own shattered self. The vibrant woman he'd been so captivated by was reduced to a frightened shadow, her eyes wide and haunted. The realization of their monstrous secret, the incestuous nature of their relationship, hung between them like a suffocating fog. "It's over, Ava," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, the words cutting through the silence like shards of glass. "Everything is over." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with the finality of his defeat. The gilded cage had indeed imploded, leaving them both exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone, facing the devastating consequences of their impulsive decisions. The silence that followed was broken only by the persistent ringing of the phone, a stark reminder of the storm raging outside and the far greater tempest brewing within. The cacophony outside Julian's penthouse mirrored the turmoil within. Sirens wailed, a relentless soundtrack to his ruin. News helicopters buzzed like angry wasps, their spotlights slicing through the darkness, painting the city in harsh, accusatory light. Inside, the champagne flutes lay abandoned, their remnants a pathetic symbol of a shattered celebration. Isabella's discarded wedding dress, a pristine white against the dark plush carpet, was a constant, silent reproach. Its delicate lace mocked the brutal unraveling of his life. The scent of lilies, once sweet and hopeful, now hung heavy and cloying, like a funeral wreath. Ava, her face pale and drawn, flinched at each distant siren. The vibrant woman who'd captivated him was gone, replaced by a frightened, vulnerable girl. Her eyes, once sparkling with mischief, now held a deep well of fear and regret. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the din. They know. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the untouched breakfast on the table, a cruel reminder of a morning that promised joy, not this catastrophic downfall. The meticulously prepared pastries, now cold and stale, mirrored his own hardened heart. He felt a cold dread creep into his bones, a chilling realization of the magnitude of his actions. He'd not only betrayed Isabella, but he'd shattered his own carefully constructed world, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered dreams. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, suffocating. The phone buzzed again, the insistent vibration of physical assault. He let it ring, ignoring the persistent intrusion. He didn't need to answer. The world was already screaming his name in condemnation. His empire, built on ambition and ruthlessness, was crumbling, each brick falling with a resounding thud. Ava's hand reached out, tentative, brushing his arm. The touch was hesitant, laced with a mixture of fear and a desperate plea for comfort. He flinched away. "Julian," she repeated, her voice a frail whisper. "Please, say something." He finally met her gaze, but saw only a reflection of his own self-loathing. The vibrant woman he desired was a ghost, reduced to a trembling shadow of her former self. The horrifying truth, their forbidden love, their incestuous bond hung between them, heavy and suffocating. The silence stretched, filled only by the incessant wail of sirens and the relentless ringing of the phone. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within, a maelstrom of guilt, regret, and the stark realization that his impulsive act had cost him everything. Everything. The sterile white of the doctor's office felt like a tomb. The air hung thick with the unspoken, a suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each second a hammer blow against Julian's already fractured composure. Ava sat beside him, rigid, her usual vibrant aura extinguished, replaced by a stark pallor. The DNA results lay on the polished desk, a stark, clinical document detailing the horrifying truth. It's impossible," Julian breathed, his voice hoarse, the words catching in his throat. He stared at the paper, the stark black print blurring through his unshed tears. The taste of bile rose in his mouth, a bitter counterpoint to the sweetness of the champagne he'd consumed hours earlier. Ava's hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, her fingers clumsy, her movements betraying her inner turmoil. The once confident glint in her eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, lost look. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. The weight of the revelation crushed her, a suffocating blanket of guilt and disbelief. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with weary eyes, cleared her throat. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Moreau, I understand this is difficult. The results are unequivocal. There is a 99.99% probability that Ms. Moreau is your niece." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt the room spin, the polished surfaces shimmering, distorting into a grotesque mockery of his once perfect world. The opulent penthouse, the flashing lights of the paparazzi, the cheers of the wedding guests, all of it felt like a distant, horrifying dream. He had traded everything for a phantom love, a forbidden desire that had now transformed into a nightmarish reality. He looked at Ava, his niece, the woman he had betrayed Isabella for, and a wave of nausea washed over him. The vibrant woman he loved, the woman who held his heart captive, was now a tragic symbol of his own self-destruction. This was not the fairy tale he'd envisioned. It was a grotesque parody, a twisted, horrifying mockery of his own deepest desires. The silence stretched, broken only by Ava's quiet sobs, a soundtrack to Julian's crumbling world. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, an unbearable burden of guilt, regret, and a dawning realization of the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. The news spread like wildfire. One minute, Julian Thorne was a billionaire on the cusp of marital bliss. The next, he was the subject of global scorn, a pariah abandoned by society's elite. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a nightmare of his own making. He paced the floor, the polished marble cold beneath his bare feet, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of his own heart. Ava, her face etched with a grief that mirrored his own, sat slumped on a plush velvet chaise lounge, the vibrant silk a stark contrast to her ashen skin. The champagne flutes, remnants of a celebratory toast that had never been, lay scattered on a nearby table, mocking reminders of the shattered illusion. I don't understand, Julian finally whispered, the words barely audible above the pounding in his ears. The taste of ash filled his mouth, a grim parody of the exquisite meals he'd once enjoyed. Ava looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, swollen with unshed tears. "Neither do I, Julian," she choked out, her voice raw with emotion. The carefully constructed facade of the carefree mistress had crumbled, revealing a vulnerable, terrified woman. I never knew." The weight of their shared secret pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of guilt and disbelief. The luxurious surroundings, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of their monumental failure. The city lights, visible through the panoramic windows, seemed to mock their misery, their glittering brilliance a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped them. The once intimate space now felt vast, echoing with the silence of their shared catastrophe. Each tick of the clock was a reminder of time slipping away, of the irreversible damage they had wrought. The future, once so bright, was now shrouded in a bleak and uncertain fog. The sterile white of the doctor's office felt stark against the opulent backdrop of Julian's life. The air, thick with antiseptic and the unspoken weight of the results, pressed down on him. He stared at the document, the stark black lettering blurring through his unshed tears. Ava sat beside him, her hand trembling as she reached for his. The vibrant energy that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a fragile vulnerability that broke his heart. It's true," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The room seemed to tilt, the world dissolving around him. He'd lost Isabella, his reputation, his fortune, and now this horrifying, impossible truth shattered the foundations of his carefully constructed world. Ava's silence was deafening. The sterile scent of the room mixed with the metallic tang of fear in her own throat. She couldn't speak, the weight of the revelation too heavy. Her own life, already complicated by secrets and uncertain beginnings, was now irrevocably bound to this devastating truth. Their love, once so blinding, now cast a long, chilling shadow. How? Julian finally managed, his voice hoarse. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with sympathetic eyes, offered no easy answers. Only the stark reality of the DNA test, a cold, hard truth that ripped through the fragile tapestry of their lives. The drive back was a blur. The city lights, once symbols of Julian's success, now seemed cruel and mocking. He looked at Ava, her face a mask of sorrow and guilt, and a new kind of grief settled over him, grief for the woman he'd loved, grief for the family he'd betrayed, and grief for the monstrous truth that had consumed them both. The opulent penthouse, once a haven, now felt like a prison, its gilded cage suffocating them both under the unbearable weight of their secret. The silence in the car was broken only by the occasional sob escaping Ava's lips. The rhythmic thump of the car's tires on the road, a cruel counterpoint to the shattered rhythm of their lives. The future, once painted in vibrant hues, had now been reduced to shades of gray. A bleak, uncertain landscape that stretched before them, vast and terrifying. The penthouse, usually a beacon of dazzling luxury, felt like a tomb. The city lights, a blurred kaleidoscope outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, mocked Julian's shattered world. Ava sat curled on the plush sofa, her vibrant red dress a stark contrast to the ashen pallor of her face. The silence was thick, heavy with the unspoken horror of their discovery. Julian paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. He ran a hand through his hair, already streaked with gray, the gesture revealing the tremor in his hands. "It's impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to Ava. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to grasp at the absurdity of it all. Ava looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, now filled with a desolate grief. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's muted hum. The words hung in the air, fragile and unconvincing, even to her own ears. The guilt was a palpable presence, suffocating her. He stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto hers. "How could you not know?" The question was sharp, laced with a bitterness that surprised him. It wasn't the accusatory tone he'd expected, but a raw, desperate plea for some sliver of understanding in this collapsing reality. Ava flinched, her gaze dropping to her clasped hands. "My adoption records. They were sealed. I always knew something was missing, a piece of my past I couldn't quite grasp, but I never imagined." Her voice trailed off, lost in the overwhelming weight of her secret. He sank onto the arm of the sofa, the plush velvet offering little comfort. The champagne flutes, remnants of their earlier celebration, now seemed mocking symbols of their shattered joy. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of lilies and despair. "My sister, Clara," he whispered, the name a prayer and a curse. The image of his estranged sister, her face etched with a lifetime of unspoken pain, flooded his mind. The revelation wasn't just a personal catastrophe. It was a family implosion of epic proportions. The weight of his actions, the layers of deceit and betrayal, threatened to crush him. He'd destroyed more than just his own life. He'd shattered the lives of everyone he loved. The opulent penthouse, a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in the suffocating reality of his monumental mistake. The news spread like wildfire. Clara, summoned to the hospital where a distraught Ava was being treated for shock, arrived with a quiet fury simmering beneath her composed exterior. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the heavy perfume of unspoken resentment that clung to her. She stood in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over Julian, who looked 10 years older, his tailored suit rumpled and his eyes hollow. Ava, pale and fragile, lay in the bed, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman Julian had abandoned Isabella for. "Julian." Clara's voice was low, each syllable precise, laced with a controlled anger that was far more chilling than any outburst. The word hung in the air, heavy with years of suppressed emotion. "You have destroyed everything." Julian flinched. He hadn't anticipated this level of rage, this icy rejection. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and self-loathing. He could only manage a broken whisper. I didn't know." Clara laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the small room. "Didn't know? You didn't know you were betting your own niece? You, with your wealth and your power, couldn't have investigated? You made a choice, Julian. A reckless, selfish choice, and now look at the devastation." Ava stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw Clara, her face a mask of controlled fury, and the pain etched deep into her own face intensified. "Aunt Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling. The word itself, laced with a mixture of fear and longing, hung heavy in the silence that followed. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room seemed to amplify the tension. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the bitter taste of betrayal and the overwhelming weight of shattered dreams. Julian watched, helpless, as the two women, bound by blood and now by this shared tragedy, silently assessed the wreckage of his life. The comfortable silence of his opulent penthouse now felt miles away, a distant memory of a life that no longer existed. He was stripped bare, exposed not just to the public scorn, but to the raw, unfiltered fury of his own sister. The opulent cage had imploded, leaving him only with the devastating consequences of his choices. The silence was broken only by Ava's soft sobs, a heartbreaking counterpoint to Clara's simmering anger, leaving Julian alone in the epicenter of his self-made destruction. The hospital room felt sterile, a stark contrast to the opulent settings Julian was accustomed to. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence, a silence thick with unspoken accusations. Ava's soft sobs punctuated the stillness, a heartbreaking counterpoint to Clara's rigid composure. Clara's eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now cold, glacial. They held the weight of years of disappointment, of a sisterly bond irrevocably broken. Julian watched, a ghost of his former self. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his power, now hung loosely, mirroring the collapse of his carefully constructed world. He felt the sting of Clara's words, each one a hammer blow to his already shattered ego. He'd built his life on a foundation of lies, and now the structure was crumbling around him, burying him under the debris of his own making. Ava's trembling hand reached out to Clara's, a desperate plea for connection, for understanding. Clara didn't flinch, didn't recoil, but neither did she offer any solace. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air like a suffocating shroud. The scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the bitter tang of betrayal that permeated the room. I wanted to explain, Julian stammered, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the suffocating silence. His words were swallowed by the magnitude of his actions, by the devastating consequences he had unleashed. He tried to rise, to approach his sister, but his legs felt weak, his body heavy with remorse. Clara's gaze remained fixed on Ava, her expression unreadable. The unspoken question hung between them. How could Julian have done this? How could he have been so blind, so reckless? The weight of the question pressed down on the room, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt the full force of his sister's silent judgment, the crushing weight of her disappointment. He had lost more than his fortune. He had lost his family, his reputation, and, most devastatingly, his own self-respect. The opulent cage had indeed imploded, leaving him utterly alone amidst the wreckage of his life. The mahogany door to Julian's childhood home felt heavier than it ever had before. He'd expected coldness, but the silence that greeted him was worse, a suffocating blanket of unspoken grief. The air hung thick with the scent of lilies, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell of the hospital. He found Clara in the library, sunlight slanting across the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the fragile beauty of her grief. She sat amidst towering bookshelves, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her posture rigid with unshed tears. "Clara," he began, his voice a mere breath against the silence. She didn't look up. The faintest tremor ran through her shoulders, a silent testament to her inner turmoil. The years etched into her face seemed deeper, more profound than he remembered. I wanted to apologize," he continued, the words catching in his throat. The carefully rehearsed speech crumbled in the face of her quiet sorrow. He felt the weight of his actions, a crushing burden he couldn't escape. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. "Apology isn't enough, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with a chilling intensity. "You've destroyed everything." The words hung in the air, sharp and precise, each one a tiny blade piercing his already wounded heart. He sank into a chair, the plush velvet offering no comfort. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow to his already fractured soul. He wanted to explain, to justify his actions, but the words caught in his throat. How could he possibly explain the irrationality of his choices, the blinding allure of a connection built on a foundation of lies? Ava, she's my niece, he finally managed, the confession a raw, exposed wound. Clara's gaze finally lifted, locking with his. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and sisterly affection, held only a chilling emptiness. "And what do you expect me to say, Julian?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion, a testament to her profound pain. "That this makes everything better?" The weight of her silence, the sharp edge of her words, they were a far crueler punishment than any public shaming could ever be. He was stripped bare, exposed in his utter failure as a brother, a son, a man. The gilded cage had indeed collapsed, crushing him beneath the weight of his own reckless choices. The opulent life he cherished was nothing compared to the emptiness gnawing at his soul. The silence continued, the unspoken accusations hanging heavier than any condemnation. The news had spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of scorched earth in its wake. Julian's opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage, suffocating him with its silence. He stared out at the rain-lashed city, the glittering lights blurring into a meaningless kaleidoscope. The champagne wishes and caviar dreams had curdled into a bitter taste of regret. Clara's arrival was unexpected. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the stormy night, a stark contrast to the opulent interior. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now shadowed with grief, etched with lines of pain he'd never noticed before. The scent of lilies, her favorite, clung to her like a shroud. "I should have known," she said, her voice low and trembling, the words sharp as shards of glass. She didn't approach him, remaining rooted in the doorway, a statue of wounded dignity. The silence that followed hung heavy, filled with the unspoken accusations that echoed between them. Julian flinched. He'd anticipated anger, but this quiet devastation was far more devastating. He watched as she moved with a slow grace, a fragile porcelain doll about to shatter. She walked over to the window, her reflection superimposed upon the city's stormy visage. "Ava, she's my daughter," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the roaring city. The words hung in the air, a final, damning truth. There was no outburst, no dramatic confrontation, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. He approached her a hesitant step, then another. The years of distance, the unspoken resentments, the carefully constructed walls, they all crumbled under the weight of this revelation. He reached out, his hand trembling, to touch her shoulder. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. "I didn't know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. The words felt inadequate, hollow, a pitiful attempt to bridge the chasm that yawned between them. He felt the sting of her silent judgment, the immeasurable pain he had inflicted. Clara turned, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, more profound sorrow. "You destroyed my life, Julian," she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "And now you've destroyed hers too." The unspoken weight of her words was far heavier than any accusation. The rain continued to lash against the windows, mirroring the storm raging within them both. The gilded cage had indeed collapsed, burying them both beneath the rubble of his impulsive, devastating decision. The weight of the world pressed down on Julian. His penthouse, once a symbol of untouchable success, now felt like a mausoleum. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, were blurred, indistinct through a haze of self-loathing. The opulent furnishings, once sources of pride, mocked him with their cold, silent grandeur. He hadn't slept in days, the champagne-fueled nights replaced by a relentless cycle of regret and self-recrimination. He ran a hand through his hair, the once meticulously styled locks now disheveled, mirroring the chaos within. A knock on the door startled him. He braced himself, expecting another journalist, another creditor, another face twisted in righteous anger. Instead, it was Mr. Davies, his longtime lawyer, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. Davies held a file, its thickness a grim testament to the avalanche of legal documents cascading down on him. "The board has voted," Davies said, his voice a low rumble. "They've initiated proceedings to remove you from your position as CEO." Julian nodded, the words landing with a dull thud. It wasn't a surprise, not really. He'd expected it. Losing his company, his fortune, was a small price to pay compared to the devastation he'd wrought on his family, on Ava, on Isabella. The true cost was measured in shattered trust, irreparable damage, and the gnawing emptiness that gnawed at his soul. "They're freezing your assets," Davies continued, his voice barely a whisper. "You've lost everything, Julian." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Julian felt a strange calm settle over him, a chilling acceptance. The gilded cage had indeed imploded. He was stripped bare, exposed, vulnerable. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something akin to clarity. The hollow victory of wealth and power had evaporated, leaving behind a stark, desolate landscape. He was alone, facing the consequences of his actions and the long, arduous journey of self-forgiveness, if it was even possible. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the tempest within. His fall was complete. The opulent penthouse, once a sanctuary of indulgence, now felt like a tomb. Sunlight, a mocking reminder of brighter days, sliced through the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian sat hunched on the plush, yet unforgiving sofa, the weight of his actions pressing down like a physical burden. He hadn't eaten, hadn't shaved. The stubble on his face mirrored the rough edges of his shattered life. A sharp knock at the door. He flinched, the sound jarring him from his self-imposed exile. It was Clara, her face etched with a grief that mirrored his own, yet held a steely resolve he lacked. She didn't speak, just stood there, her presence a stark contrast to the opulent emptiness of the room. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and regret. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice a low, controlled tremor. "You destroyed everything, Julian. Everything." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the lines etched by years of unspoken pain, the weariness in her eyes. "I know," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The hollow ache in his chest intensified. He wanted to reach for her, to beg for forgiveness, but the chasm between them felt too wide, too deep. "Ava, she's your niece," Clara's voice cracked, a raw wound reopened. The pain in her voice hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, the guilt a searing brand on his soul. He saw her pain, felt its echo in his own heart. I didn't know," he managed, his voice barely audible. The words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of the devastation he'd caused. The silence stretched again, broken only by the mournful whisper of the wind outside. The city, once a symbol of his triumph, now felt like a silent judge, its lights a cold, unforgiving glare. The weight of his actions, the shattering of his illusions, pressed down on him. He was a ruin both inside and out. He was stripped bare, his wealth, power, and reputation vanished. Only the raw, brutal truth remained. The journey towards redemption would be long and arduous. Yet the first step, acknowledging his profound guilt and the hurt he had caused, was the most crucial step yet. The penthouse, once a symbol of Julian's untouchable status, now felt claustrophobic. Dust motes, illuminated by the weak afternoon sun, swirled in the stagnant air, mirroring the turmoil within him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each chime a stark reminder of time relentlessly marching on. He stared at his reflection in the darkened glass of a highball glass, barely recognizing the gaunt, hollow-eyed man staring back. He hadn't slept properly in days, the nightmares relentless, a replay of Clara's pained face, the accusation burning in her eyes. A soft knock, hesitant and gentle, unlike Clara's earlier, forceful one. He flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew it was Ava. He hadn't seen her since the DNA results shattered their world. He didn't want to see her, yet the thought of her alone, grappling with the fallout, was almost unbearable. He opened the door a crack. Ava stood there, her vibrant energy dimmed, replaced by a fragility that tugged at something deep within him. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were red-rimmed and filled with a haunted sorrow. She held a small, worn photograph, her fingers tracing the image of a younger Clara. I found this," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "In my grandmother's things. It was hidden." She pushed the photograph toward him, her hand trembling. The picture showed a younger Clara, radiating a warmth Julian hadn't seen in years. He recognized a hint of his own features in her youthful face, a stark reminder of the blood connection that now bound them in a horrifying embrace. Julian took the photograph, his fingers tracing the faded image. He was seeing Clara, not as the bitter, resentful woman she'd become, but as a young woman brimming with hope, before the weight of her secrets crushed her spirit. A wave of grief washed over him, a tsunami of regret crashing against the shores of his hardened heart. He started, his voice catching in his throat. He couldn't find the words to express the depth of his remorse, the enormity of his betrayal. All he could do was let the silence speak the unsayable. Ava stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume, a once intoxicating scent, now tinged with a heartbreaking sadness. She reached out, hesitantly, her fingers brushing his. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The words hung between them, fragile and burdened with the weight of unspoken truths. The opulent penthouse faded into the background, the only reality the raw, visceral pain that connected them. A pain born of family secrets and devastating choices. The journey towards redemption had just begun, a path fraught with hardship, but for the first time, the possibility of healing, however fragile, glimmered faintly in the gathering dusk. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispering anxieties. Julian sat, a ghost in a tailored suit, the expensive fabric a cruel mockery of his inner desolation. The judge's gavel fell, a final, crushing blow. Bankruptcy, his empire, built on ambition and ruthlessness, lay in ruins. He felt a dull ache behind his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down with crushing force. Later, the penthouse, once a sanctuary of excess, felt like a mausoleum. He wandered through the echoing rooms, each opulent detail a painful reminder of his fallen status. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of his lavish lifestyle, now felt suffocating, cloying in the heavy silence. He found Clara in the library, amidst the towering shelves that held the histories of generations he had so carelessly betrayed. She sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her face etched with an unbearable sorrow. The once vibrant color in her eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Clara," he began, his voice a mere rasp. He reached out, but she flinched away, her hand instinctively going to the small scar on her wrist, a silent testament to a childhood marred by his absence. "Don't," she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Don't touch me. You've taken everything." The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations, the years of resentment, the wounds that ran deeper than any legal document could ever acknowledge. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating. He saw his reflection in the polished wood of the desk, a stranger staring back, his eyes hollow and haunted. He sank into a chair opposite her, the ornate carvings digging into his skin, a physical representation of the deep wounds within. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in years, beyond the resentment, the anger, to the core of her pain. He saw a woman broken by his actions, a woman who deserved so much more. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to know, I am truly sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile and inadequate. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a faint glimmer of the woman he remembered from his childhood, the sister who had once held his hand. But it was quickly overshadowed by the pain. The long, arduous road to forgiveness lay ahead, a journey fraught with hardship and uncertainty. But in that moment, amidst the wreckage of his life, a single, fragile seed of hope took root. The sprawling Thorn estate felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Julian wandered the deserted halls, the polished marble cold beneath his bare feet. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the aging structure. He stopped before a painting of his parents, their smiles frozen in a time before the fractures in his family had widened into chasms. Guilt gnawed at him, a constant companion in his self-imposed exile. He found Clara in the sunroom, the afternoon light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat enveloped in a worn armchair, a book lying open and unread on her lap. Her posture was rigid, her gaze fixed on the overgrown garden beyond the glass. "Clara," he began, his voice hesitant, the words caught in his throat, a painful lump forming. She didn't turn. "I have nothing to say to you, Julian." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. He moved closer, the silence stretching between them, thick and suffocating. The scent of lilies, his favorite, usually a comforting presence, now felt like a cruel reminder of the opulence he had squandered. "I know that," he whispered, "but I need to try. I need to understand." He sat opposite her, the space between them a chasm of unspoken resentments. He watched her, truly saw her, the lines etched around her eyes, the slight stoop of her shoulders, the haunted look that mirrored his own. Years of neglect and betrayal, all stemming from his own selfish desires. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice barely audible. "My daughter, my trust, my peace of mind, my future." Tears finally welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply sat, absorbing the full weight of her sorrow, the devastation he had wrought. The silence was finally broken by the soft sob that escaped her lips, a sound that echoed the profound emptiness he felt within. He reached out, slowly, cautiously, his hand hovering near hers. This time she didn't flinch. A single tear fell on the worn fabric of her dress, a small, poignant symbol of her broken heart and the long, arduous journey towards possible healing. The process of rebuilding their relationship, he understood, would be a slow, painstaking endeavor, a testament to the strength of familial bonds, even in the face of unforgivable actions. The rented cottage smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of his former life. Julian sat hunched on a worn armchair, the rough texture a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm raging within him. He reread Clara's terse email, the words stinging like icy needles. "I need time," it simply stated. He understood. Trust, like a shattered vase, couldn't be simply glued back together. Days bled into weeks. He spent hours staring out at the relentless gray sea, the waves a relentless metaphor for his own turbulent emotions. He attempted phone calls, short, hesitant messages, all met with silence. He felt the familiar gnawing of guilt, sharper now, intensified by his isolation. He was a pariah, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, his family. The only things remaining were the crushing weight of his actions and the gnawing emptiness he'd always tried to fill with superficial pleasures. One blustery afternoon, a knock on the door startled him. He braced himself, expecting a bill collector, a journalist, anyone but Clara. She stood on the doorstep, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face, making her look almost fragile. He opened the door wider, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. I came," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words lost almost immediately to the wind. He didn't speak, just stepped aside, letting her enter. The cottage's small interior felt suddenly charged with unspoken emotions. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the worn rug beneath her feet. I needed to see the place where you've been hiding." Her voice, though still shaky, held a note of something else. Curiosity? A flicker of hope? He watched her, a silent observer of her inner struggle, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her hands clenched and unclenched. "I haven't been hiding," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been processing." She finally looked up, her eyes locking with his. They were filled with a mixture of pain, anger, and something resembling forgiveness. The long, arduous road to reconciliation stretched before them, fraught with obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a glimmer of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, but undeniably there. The rain continued to fall outside, but within the small cottage, a tiny spark of warmth began to ignite. The cottage's rough-hewn beams felt cold against Julian's cheek as he lay sleepless. The wind howled, a mournful symphony outside, mirroring the turmoil within. Clara's visit, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of betrayal, left him both exhilarated and terrified. He'd felt the tentative shift in her, a crack in the icy wall she'd erected around her grief. But the fear lingered, the fear of losing her again, the fear of the depth of his own failings. Dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised purples and hesitant pinks. He rose, the chill of the stone floor seeping into his bare feet. The smell of wood smoke, sharp and clean, offered a fleeting comfort. He brewed strong coffee, the rich aroma a temporary balm to his frayed nerves. He needed to reach out, to bridge the gap before the fragile hope withered. He found Clara sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, staring out at the tumultuous sea. The wind whipped her hair around her face, making her look even more vulnerable. He approached slowly, the gravel crunching under his feet, a sound that amplified the silence between them. "The coffee's ready," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She didn't turn, but a slight nod acknowledged his presence. He poured 2 mugs, the warmth of the ceramic a stark contrast to the chill in the air. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. "I know saying sorry isn't enough," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "But I am truly sorry, Clara, for everything." She finally turned, her eyes, though still red-rimmed, held a flicker of something akin to understanding. "It's not just the everything you did to me, Julian," she said, her voice low and husky. "It's the everything you did to yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation, but laced with a weary compassion. He saw the pain etched onto her face, the years of suppressed anger and hurt. He saw, too, a sliver of hope, a willingness to begin the arduous process of healing. The storm raged on outside, but within the small cottage, a fragile, tentative peace had begun to bloom. The isolation was a suffocating blanket. Julian, holed up in his rented cottage, felt the silence press in on him, a physical weight. The muted gray of the stormy sky mirrored the bleakness in his soul. Each creak of the old house was magnified, a stark reminder of his solitude. He reread Clara's terse email, the words stinging anew. "I need time." He understood. Trust, once shattered, took more than apologies to mend. He paced the small living room, the worn rug cushioning his restless feet. The scent of wood smoke, once comforting, now felt acrid, a symbol of the ashes of his former life. His reflection in the dusty window pane was a stranger gaunt, haunted eyes staring back from a face etched with regret. He picked up a framed photo, his hand trembling slightly. It showed a younger, carefree Julian, arm in arm with a smiling Clara, their laughter echoing silently from the past. The sharp pang of grief was a physical blow. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, the amber liquid burning a path down his throat, offering only temporary numbness. The phone rang, the shrill sound jarring him out of his self-pity. He hesitated, then answered. Ava's voice, hesitant and small, filled the room. "Julian, I need to talk." Her voice broke, the composure he'd always admired shattered. He felt a surge of unexpected guilt. He'd forgotten about Ava, lost in the maelstrom of his own self-recrimination. He knew she needed him, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the pain she carried. He understood he needed to start despite that feeling. "I know," he said, his voice raspy. Come to the cottage." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. The stormy sea outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within him, the waves crashing against the shore, relentless and unforgiving, much like his inner turmoil. He took a deep breath. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, to confront not only his family but the devastation he had wrought upon himself and those around him. The cottage smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, a scent that clung to everything, even Julian's worn tweed jacket. Rain lashed against the windows, a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil in Ava's heart. She stood on the porch, hesitant, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She hadn't seen Julian since the aftermath of the scandal, a lifetime compressed into a few agonizing weeks. His silence had been a heavier burden than any public condemnation. He opened the door before she could knock, his face etched with weariness, his eyes, usually bright and sharp, shadowed with grief. The cottage's interior was sparse, almost austere, a stark contrast to the opulent life he'd once known. "Ava," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped aside, allowing her entry. She came in, the cold rain clinging to her coat. I didn't know where else to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant, agonizing companion. He closed the door behind her, the sound a small, decisive act in the vastness of his desolation. "I understand," he said, his gaze unwavering. He gestured towards a worn armchair by the fireplace. "Sit." She sank into the chair, the worn fabric surprisingly soft against her damp clothes. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Ava watched him, the man who once seemed invincible now reduced to a fragile shell. "I'm sorry, Julian," she finally said, her voice barely a breath. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even, in the face of the devastation she'd caused. He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. Then he spoke, his voice devoid of bitterness. "It's not enough, Ava. None of this was about you being my niece. It was about my own failings, my own self-destruction." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "You were just a convenient scapegoat." The weight of his words hung in the air. Ava's shoulders slumped. He didn't hate her. He pitied her, understood her. And in that understanding, she found a sliver of hope, a fragile seed of forgiveness. She'd hurt him deeply, yes, but his acceptance, his self-awareness, offered a path toward her own redemption. The rain continued to fall outside, a mournful soundtrack to their unspoken conversation, a testament to the storm that still raged within them both, a storm they would have to weather together. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Clara's sparsely furnished apartment. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the grimy window panes, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. Clara sat rigidly on the edge of a worn armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. Julian stood before her, his expensive suit looking jarringly out of place amidst the modest surroundings. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations and a fragile hope for reconciliation. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the ticking clock. "I know I hurt you, Clara, more than words can say. I destroyed your trust." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the exhaustion etched onto his face. Clara didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the worn rug beneath her feet. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, filled with the weight of years of unspoken grievances and the raw agony of betrayal. Then, slowly, she raised her head, her eyes, usually sparkling with a mischievous light, now filled with a profound sadness. "You didn't just hurt me, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You hurt Ava. You hurt Isabella. You hurt yourself." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. "And you hurt the very fabric of our family." Julian winced, the pain evident in the subtle flinch of his jaw. He reached out a hand, hesitant, as if fearing rejection. He stopped short, drawing his hand back. "I know, and I'm trying to understand what I did. Why I did it." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't just Ava. It was everything. The pressure, the expectations." He trailed off, his voice caught in his throat. Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I know, Julian, but understanding doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring back the trust. It doesn't undo what's been done." She took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "But maybe we can start rebuilding." A flicker of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, appeared in her eyes. The faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. "Maybe we can start over, but it will take time. A lot of time." Julian looked at his sister, the woman he had wounded so deeply, and a wave of profound remorse washed over him. He knew the road to redemption would be long and arduous, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile spark in the darkness. The rain outside had stopped, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a small patch of the worn rug. It was a small beginning, a tiny sign of hope in the ruins of his life. The rain lashed against the windows of Ava's small, rented apartment, mirroring the storm raging inside her. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table, testament to sleepless nights filled with guilt and self-recrimination. The vibrant colors that once defined her apartment now felt muted, dulled by the weight of her actions. She stared at a faded photograph, a younger, carefree Ava, beaming beside a younger Clara, their arms around each other. The memory, sharp and painful, stung her eyes. A knock on the door startled her. Hesitantly, she opened it to reveal a tired-looking Julian. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a simple sweater. The arrogance that had once cloaked him was replaced by a vulnerability that both frightened and intrigued her. "Ava," he began, his voice a low rasp. I need to talk." She stepped aside, letting him in. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. He looked around the apartment, his eyes lingering on the photograph. "I know I hurt you," he said finally, his gaze meeting hers. "More than just the betrayal. I took away your chance at a life you deserved. A life you could have had if I hadn't been so selfish." Ava's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't just me, Julian. It was Clara, Isabella, everyone." Her voice trembled. I'm so sorry." He moved towards her, his hands outstretched. She didn't pull away. He gently took her hands in his touch surprisingly tender. "We both made terrible mistakes," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But we can't change the past. All we can do is try to make amends." He spoke of his attempts to reconnect with Clara, of the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust. He spoke of his newfound understanding of family, of the importance of genuine connection, a concept that had eluded him for so long. He spoke of the emptiness he had felt, the superficiality of his previous life. Ava listened, captivated by the raw honesty in his voice, the depth of his remorse. The rain finally began to subside, the drumming on the window pane softening to a gentle patter. A sliver of moonlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating a single tear rolling down Ava's cheek. It was a tear of sorrow, yes, but also a tear of fragile hope. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, forgiveness and even redemption might be possible. The chipped paint on Ava's windowsill was a perfect metaphor for her life. Cracked, faded, but still clinging on. The city noise, usually a grating cacophony, was a muted hum tonight, swallowed by the weight of her guilt. Julian's words, raw and honest, echoed in her mind. His confession hadn't brought immediate relief, only a heavy ache in her chest. She touched the faded photograph again, Clara's youthful smile a ghost of a happier time. The apartment felt smaller now, the emptiness amplifying the silence between them. Julian sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the worn rug, his hands clasped tightly. The moonlight, filtering through the gaps in the blinds, cast long shadows that danced like restless spirits. I never knew Clara gave me up," Ava finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The confession was a ragged breath, years of unspoken fear finally escaping. I always felt different." Julian nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his weary eyes. "Your mother, she didn't tell you?" Ava shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "She spoke of a sister, a loss, but nothing concrete. It was a void I never understood." She traced the outline of Clara's face in the photograph, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. "She protected you," Julian said softly, his voice thick with empathy, "in her own way." He reached across the space between them, his hand hovering over hers before gently resting upon it. The contact was a spark, igniting a fragile connection that had been shattered and scorched. "I wanted a life, a different life," Ava confessed, the words a raw admission of her past ambitions. "But not this." The weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating her. Julian squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a damp stillness. The city lights twinkled in the distance, offering a faint glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a fragile understanding beginning to bloom in the heart of their shared devastation. The road to redemption was long and fraught with obstacles, but in that small, dimly lit apartment, a flicker of forgiveness had been ignited. The mahogany door of Isabella's penthouse apartment felt heavy, almost symbolic of the weight Julian carried. He hadn't seen her since that catastrophic day, the memory of her heartbroken gaze seared into his soul. The city lights glittered below, a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of her interior. He could almost feel the ghost of her presence, the faint scent of lilies, a lingering perfume that was both hauntingly familiar and unbearably poignant. Isabella stood by the window, her back to him, a slender silhouette against the cityscape. The soft light illuminated the delicate curve of her neck. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the vast space. "Isabella," he began, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the city's hum. He watched her shoulders stiffen, a subtle tremor betraying her composure. She turned, her eyes wide, dark pools reflecting the city lights, met his. There was no anger, only a profound sadness, a quiet dignity that humbled him further. He saw a woman who had survived his betrayal stronger, perhaps, than he deserved. I needed to see you," he said, his words stumbling over each other. "To apologize, truly." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the low thrum of the city. The air hung heavy with unspoken words, with regret and a fragile hope. She didn't speak, only met his gaze, her expression unreadable. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps pity, perhaps weariness, but no hatred. "There's no excuse," Julian continued, his voice raw with remorse. "None. What I did was unforgivable." He watched a single tear trace a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the pain he had inflicted, the pain he was now desperately trying to understand. It wasn't just the public humiliation, he realized now. It was the shattering of a trust that could never be fully mended. He took a tentative step closer, then another until he stood before her, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a fragile understanding beginning to bloom, tentatively, like a delicate flower pushing through the hard earth. He wanted to reach out, to offer some form of solace, but he hesitated, acutely aware of the distance that separated them, a chasm carved by his own actions. The scent of old books and dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through the library's arched windows filled the air. Julian sat across from Isabella, the plush velvet of the antique sofa a stark contrast to the raw edges of his remorse. He'd chosen this quiet, almost forgotten corner of his once grand estate, a place where the echoes of his former life felt less suffocating. Healing. As they ladled out soup, a shared glance passed between them, brief yet profound. It was in that shared moment, amidst the quiet bustle of the soup kitchen, that Julian felt the first fragile tendrils of true redemption begin to take root. The path ahead was still long and arduous, but for the first time, the weight on his shoulders felt slightly lighter, a glimmer of hope illuminating the long road to forgiveness. The hum of the soup kitchen, a low thrum of activity, was a comforting counterpoint to the turmoil still swirling within Julian. He watched Clara, her movements precise and efficient, a stark contrast to the elegant, almost brittle woman he remembered. The scent of simmering vegetables, a comforting earthy aroma, mingled with the faint metallic tang of antiseptic from a nearby cut on her hand. He'd offered to tend to it, but she'd waved him off, a small, almost shy smile playing on her lips. Later, amidst the quiet clearing of tables, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to give her up, Julian, but I was young, scared, alone. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his remorse. He wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but he knew that any gesture, too forceful, would shatter the delicate truce they'd established. He nodded, understanding shimmering in his eyes. I know, he said, his voice husky, and I understand the reasons you made your decision, even though it still hurts. He paused, searching for the right words. I wish I had been there for you, both of you. Clara met his gaze, her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, now holding a deep well of sadness. It's not your fault, Julian. We both made mistakes. She looked away, focusing on stacking plates, the delicate china clicking softly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but rather a shared space of acknowledged pain, a recognition of shared burdens. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the silence, making it both profound and intimate. The weight of the past, the betrayal, the shattered illusions, it still pressed down on him. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't crushing. It was a weight he was learning to bear, to integrate into the fabric of his life, a reminder of the mistakes he'd made, and the path he was trying to forge towards amends. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the crisp morning air was now growing stronger, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose and the slow, tentative steps towards reconciliation. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's exposed cheeks as he walked through the park, the fallen leaves crunching under his worn shoes. He'd been volunteering at the homeless shelter, the rhythmic scrubbing of pots and pans a strangely soothing counterpoint to the chaos within him. He glanced at the donation box overflowing with goods, a small victory against the overwhelming sense of his past failures. He felt a pang of guilt, remembering Isabella's quiet dignity, the way she'd held her head high even amidst the public humiliation. He tried to reach out, but his apologies felt hollow, clumsy attempts to mend a wound he'd inflicted so deeply. Later, seated in a quiet corner of the shelter's small library, he picked up a worn copy of Anna Karenina. The parallels weren't lost on him. The impulsive passion, the devastating consequences, the slow, painful climb towards redemption. He sighed, running a hand through his now graying hair. The weight of his actions still pressed upon him, a heavy cloak he couldn't easily shed. He saw Ava's face in his mind's eye, the bright, defiant spark that had initially drawn him in, now dulled by remorse and self-loathing. He'd learned from a mutual acquaintance that she was volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding solace in caring for abandoned creatures, mirroring her own state. He considered reaching out, not for reconciliation, but for a quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. A soft cough broke his reverie. An elderly woman, her face etched with wrinkles that spoke of hardship and resilience, sat opposite him. "You seem troubled, son," she said, her voice raspy but kind. I am, Julian admitted, surprised by the ease with which he confessed to a stranger. He found himself pouring out his heart, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. He spoke of his betrayal, his niece, the wreckage of his life. The woman listened patiently, offering only gentle nods and occasional murmurs of understanding. When he finished, she smiled, a network of lines crinkling around her eyes. Sometimes, she said, her voice low and soothing, the greatest riches are found in the wreckage of our mistakes. Her words resonated deeply, striking a chord of fragile hope within him. He knew the path ahead was long, arduous, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something akin to peace. A quiet strength bloomed within, a resolve that transcended the wreckage of his past. The stale air of the rehab center hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and despair. Ava sat on the worn floral couch, her fingers nervously tracing the worn fabric. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She hadn't expected this, the sterile environment, the forced calm, the constant low hum of suppressed anxieties. It was a far cry from the opulent chaos of her former life. A knock echoed softly. Ava. It was Dr. Ramirez, his voice calm, reassuring. She swallowed, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. Yes. He entered, his expression gentle but firm. How are you feeling today? She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Guilty. Mostly guilty. That's understandable, he said softly, pulling up a chair. But guilt isn't a prison sentence, Ava. It's an opportunity. She looked up, surprised. An opportunity? To learn, to grow, to make amends. He paused, his eyes searching hers. You've been withdrawn. You haven't participated in group therapy. You haven't even looked at the photos of your family your social worker brought in. A wave of nausea washed over her. Clara's face, etched with a pain she directly caused, flashed in her mind. The thought of facing that pain again was almost unbearable. I can't, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't deserve it. Dr. Ramirez nodded understandingly. You feel you don't deserve forgiveness, perhaps, but that's not for you to decide. Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination, and it begins with facing the truth of what you've done. He leaned forward. Today, we start with the photos. His voice was laced with a gentle insistence. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ava stared at her hands, her knuckles white as she clenched them. Then slowly she nodded. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the long, arduous road ahead. The journey to redemption had begun, but the path was still shrouded in shadow, the destination far from certain. The biting November wind whipped through the graveyard, scattering fallen leaves across the freshly turned earth. Julian stood before Clara's sister's grave, a simple headstone bearing a name he barely remembered, Eleanor. The chill seeped into his bones, mirroring the icy grip of guilt that had clamped around his heart for months. He hadn't visited before. Shame had kept him away. He'd brought lilies, Clara's favorite, their white petals pristine against the somber gray of the stone. He knelt, the damp earth cold against his knees. He hadn't spoken to Clara in weeks, the chasm between them still vast and unbridgeable. Her silence was a heavy weight, a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he'd caused. A sob escaped him, ragged and raw. He clutched the lilies, the scent a fragile counterpoint to the bitter tang of regret. He closed his eyes, the image of Ava's tear-stained face superimposed over Eleanor's name. He'd destroyed so much, shattered trust he'd never thought he could break. The wealth, the power, the glittering facade, all meaningless now. He opened his eyes, noticing a figure standing a few feet away, cloaked in shadow. As he looked closer, he saw it was Clara. She hadn't spoken, but her presence was a silent accusation. He expected anger, but her face was etched with a weariness that was almost worse. I didn't know Eleanor was buried here, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. She was always overlooked. Her gaze lingered on the lilies. She loved lilies too. There was a flicker of something akin to forgiveness in her eyes, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the icy frost of pain. He stood, offering the flowers to her. I came to apologize." The words felt inadequate, pale imitations of the remorse that consumed him. Clara took the lilies, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, electric in its intensity, pulsed between them. The touch was fleeting, but its meaning resonated deep within Julian's soul. It was a fragile bridge, stretched across the chasm of their broken relationship. It was the first tentative step towards repair. The wind howled again, but this time, it didn't feel quite so bleak. The seeds of forgiveness, planted in the cold earth, might yet blossom. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window of Julian's sparsely furnished apartment. He hadn't bothered to replace the opulent furnishings. The emptiness echoed the hollowness within him. He traced the rim of a chipped teacup, the porcelain cool against his fingertips, a stark contrast to the burning shame that still consumed him. He hadn't touched alcohol in months, a small victory in a life otherwise defined by loss. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. He hesitated, bracing himself for another confrontation, another wave of accusations. He hadn't seen Ava since the scandal broke, her absence a heavy, suffocating blanket. Opening the door, he found her standing on the threshold, her face pale and drawn, the vibrant energy he once found so alluring now replaced by a quiet fragility. I wanted to see you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were clouded with a deep, unsettling sorrow. He stepped aside, allowing her entry. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the window panes. The scent of damp wool clung to her coat, a faint perfume still lingering beneath. "I know I hurt you," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the floor. "And Clara, and everyone. I'm so sorry." The words seemed to hang heavy in the air, each syllable laden with regret. He saw a tremor in her hand, a testament to the weight of her guilt. He watched her, a silent observer, her words mirroring the storm raging within his own heart. He longed to understand the depths of her remorse, to believe in her sincerity. But the scar of betrayal ran too deep. "It's not just about being sorry, Ava," he finally said, his voice low and husky. "It's about understanding the depth of what you did and what it cost." She nodded slowly, her head bowed. "I understand," she breathed, her voice breaking. "I've been trying to understand. I've been looking at myself, trying to understand who I am, who I was." The raw honesty in her voice resonated with him, a stark reminder of the shared pain that bound them. The rain intensified, the rhythm a relentless counterpoint to the turbulent emotions filling the small apartment. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, laden with unspoken accusations and the faint glimmer of hope. The seeds of forgiveness, he realized, were planted, not in the cold earth of a graveyard, but in the silent acknowledgement of shared responsibility. The arduous journey towards redemption, for both of them, had begun. Ava's journey of self-discovery wasn't a linear path. It was a chaotic scramble through the wreckage of her life. The city, once a glittering backdrop to her carefree existence, now felt like a suffocating cage. The penthouse suite, a symbol of Julian's wealth and her fleeting triumph, stood empty, a stark testament to her fall from grace. She traded it for a small, sparsely furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood, the muted colors a stark contrast to her once vibrant wardrobe. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise a painful reminder of her betrayal. She found solace not in the shallow pleasures she once craved, but in the quiet solitude of a small community garden. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine offered a fragile balm to her wounded spirit. The rhythmic digging, the gentle caress of soil on her hands, felt like a form of penance, a slow, deliberate act of rebuilding. One afternoon, while tending to a patch of forget-me-nots, ironically, a young woman approached her, her face etched with a weariness that resonated deeply with Ava. They fell into conversation, a hesitant exchange of words initially, then a torrent of shared experiences. The woman, Sarah, was a single mother struggling to make ends meet, her story a poignant echo of Ava's own hidden vulnerabilities. A shared cup of tea, offered amidst the fragrant blossoms, marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Sarah's quiet strength, her resilience in the face of adversity, ignited a spark of hope within Ava. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but a glimmer of a different path. A path carved not through deceit, but through empathy and genuine connection. The weight of her past remained, a constant companion, but it no longer held the same suffocating power. The garden, once a sanctuary for solitary reflection, now felt like a space of shared growth and healing, a testament to the possibility of a new beginning. The scent of wood smoke and pine hung heavy in the crisp mountain air as Julian approached the cabin. Clara's silence, a wall built over years of hurt, pressed down on him. He'd driven for hours, the landscape mirroring the turmoil within, stark, unforgiving, yet strangely beautiful. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching the smoke curl lazily from the chimney. It was a picture of peaceful solitude, a stark contrast to the storm raging within his soul. He knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Clara, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. Her eyes, once bright with mischief, now held a quiet sadness. "Julian," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin a welcome contrast to the biting cold. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something faintly sweet, like baking bread. It was a simple cabin, furnished with worn but comfortable pieces, a testament to a life lived simply, a life he'd never fully appreciated. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. I don't know where to begin." She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the crackling fire. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on her face, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of sorrow. Finally, she spoke, her voice still low, but steadier now. "Begin with the truth, Julian," she said, her voice laced with a hint of steel. "Begin with the truth about everything." He nodded, the simple act a physical manifestation of his willingness to finally confront his past. He started to talk, words tumbling out in a torrent of confession and remorse. He spoke of his selfishness, his arrogance, his blindness to the love he'd thrown away. He spoke of the pain he'd inflicted, the bonds he'd broken, the trust he'd betrayed. His voice cracked several times. As he spoke, the silence in the cabin deepened, punctuated only by the crackling fire and his own confessions. Clara listened patiently, her gaze unwavering. When he finished, a long silence hung between them, heavier than the mountain air. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand covering his. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, not yet, but an acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the shared burden they carried. The beginning of healing. The cabin's warmth embraced Julian, a stark contrast to the icy grip of his guilt. The scent of wood smoke and baking bread mingled, a homely aroma that felt profoundly alien after months of sterile hotel rooms and hushed whispers. Clara's hand, cool and surprisingly firm in his, offered a fragile anchor in the storm of his remorse. He'd confessed, laid bare his soul, the words tumbling out like a dam finally breaking. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. He watched the firelight dance on her face, catching the faintest glimmer of forgiveness in her eyes. It wasn't a full blossoming, more a tentative bud pushing through the frozen ground of years of hurt. I understand if you can't forgive me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Clara squeezed his hand, a slight pressure that spoke volumes. "Forgiveness isn't something I can just grant," she said, her voice low and measured. "It's something I have to earn, and that takes time, Julian. A lot of time." He nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He deserved the slow, agonizing climb back to grace. The fire crackled, a comforting counterpoint to the turmoil within. Outside, the wind howled a mournful song, mirroring the lingering pain in his heart. He shifted, pulling his hand away slightly, aware of the need to respect her space, her carefully guarded emotions. "Ava," he began, the single word thick with unspoken consequences. Clara's hand stilled. The warmth seemed to drain from the room. She's trying," Clara said, her voice strained. "She's volunteering at a women's shelter, trying to make amends. It's a small thing, but..." Her voice trailed off, a testament to the lingering complexity of their shared trauma. "I know it's not enough," Julian said quietly, "and neither is anything I can do, but I will try. I owe you both that much." The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of self-recrimination. He looked into Clara's eyes, searching for any sign of acceptance, for a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But in the quiet solace of that mountain cabin, warmed by the fire and the fragile warmth of Clara's hand, he felt a sliver of hope. The path to redemption was long and uncertain, but he was finally ready to walk it. The crisp mountain air bit at Julian's cheeks as he helped Clara chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a counterpoint to the silence between them, was almost comforting. He'd spent weeks in this secluded cabin, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of the scandal that had consumed him. The scent of pine filled his lungs, a sharp, clean fragrance that did little to cleanse the bitter taste of regret. The shelter. "Ava's doing well there?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the neatly stacked wood. "She seems different, more grounded. She speaks of the women she helps, their stories. It's a start." Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotional charge he expected. He watched her, the lines etched around her eyes a testament to the pain he'd inflicted. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden. He'd lost everything: his fortune, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. Yet, the emptiness he'd felt before the scandal remained, a hollowness that no amount of money could ever fill. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A small, brown rabbit darted across the snowy path. He watched it disappear into the undergrowth, a tiny symbol of hope in the vast landscape of his self-destruction. "I understand if you never forgive me," he said, the words catching in his throat. Clara turned, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in them, only a weariness that mirrored his own. "It's not about forgiveness, Julian. It's about understanding. Understanding the choices you made, the pain you caused." He nodded, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the frigid air. The task of earning her trust, of rebuilding the shattered fragments of their relationship, seemed insurmountable. But the quiet strength in Clara's gaze, the resilience in her posture, offered a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise that perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was possible. The journey would be long, fraught with pain, but for the first time since the scandal, he felt a stirring of something akin to peace, a quiet acceptance of the arduous path ahead. The cabin's rough-hewn timbers creaked under the weight of a late winter storm. Snow piled high against the windows, blurring the already indistinct landscape. Inside, the fire cast flickering shadows on Julian's face, highlighting the lines etched by regret. He sat hunched over a worn wooden table, a half-finished letter to Isabella lying abandoned beside a chipped mug of cold tea. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of pine needles, a stark contrast to the opulent perfumes that once defined his world. Clara entered, her face pale against the firelight. She carried a steaming bowl, the aroma of broth filling the small space. "Eat something," she said, her voice softer than he remembered. He shook his head, the gesture weak. "I don't deserve it." Clara placed the bowl on the table, her gaze unwavering. "You deserve to be warm, Julian. You deserve to be nourished. Whether you deserve forgiveness, that's something you'll have to earn." Her words, though blunt, held a hint of compassion that pierced through his self-imposed isolation. He looked at the bowl, the steam rising like a fragile wisp of hope. The broth smelled of vegetables and herbs, simple and wholesome, a world away from the caviar and champagne of his former life. He picked up the spoon, the simple act feeling monumental. He ate slowly, the warmth spreading through him, a small comfort against the gnawing cold of his guilt. Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind's mournful howl. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within him. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes searching hers for any sign of judgment. What he found instead was weariness, a deep empathy that mirrored his own pain. He saw not the sister he had hurt, but a woman who had endured her own suffering, a woman who deserved so much better than the grief he had caused. A wave of profound shame washed over him. He cleared his throat, his voice thick. I want to understand, not just about Ava, but about everything, about why I was the way I was. He spoke haltingly, each word a step toward a fragile reconciliation. Clara met his gaze, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. The long road to redemption lay ahead, but in that shared silence, in the warmth of the firelight and the steaming broth, Julian felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember against the vast darkness of his past. The crisp autumn air nipped at Julian's cheeks as he walked the winding path through the community garden. He traded his tailored suits for worn jeans and a thick sweater, the change mirroring the shift in his life. Gone were the manicured lawns and opulent estates. Now, he found solace in the earthy scent of damp soil and the vibrant colors of late-blooming chrysanthemums. He hadn't expected this quiet life, this profound sense of peace. He stopped by a small plot tended by a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands, gnarled with age, moved with surprising grace as she pruned a rose bush. He recognized her from the weekly community meetings, Miss Eleanor Vance, a former librarian with a sharp wit and a gentle soul. "Beautiful roses," he murmured, hesitant at first. Miss Vance looked up, her eyes twinkling. "They're survivors just like us," she said, her voice a low, soothing hum. "They've weathered storms, but they still bloom." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'm learning to be a survivor, too," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. The weight of his past actions still pressed down, but the crushing burden was lighter now. He no longer felt the need to hide from it. "It's a long road," Ms. Vance replied, her gaze understanding. "But the blooms are worth the wait." He nodded, watching her carefully tend to the roses, a symbol of resilience. Later, sitting on a weathered bench, he pulled out a worn sketchbook. He began to draw, sketching the garden, the roses, capturing the subtle beauty of a life lived simply. His art, once a reflection of his opulent, superficial world, now mirrored the quiet strength he was cultivating within himself. The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the shifting colors of his own inner landscape. The darkness fading, replaced by the quiet glow of a life finally found. The garden, once a fleeting escape, had become his sanctuary, a place where he could nurture not only plants, but also the fragile shoots of his own redemption. The scent of wood smoke and pine hung heavy in the crisp mountain air. Julian, perched on the porch of his small, rented cabin, watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson. The silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets, was a stark contrast to the cacophony of his former life. He traded the roar of city traffic for the whisper of the wind through the trees, a trade he hadn't realized he needed until he made it. He traced the rim of his chipped mug, the rough ceramic a comfort against his calloused fingers. The loss of his fortune hadn't been easy. The initial shock, the public humiliation, the sting of betrayal, they still lingered, ghost-like, in the corners of his memory. But the sharper edges were softening. A shadow fell across the porch. Clara stood there, her face etched with the passage of time and the weight of unspoken words. She didn't speak, merely stood silhouetted against the fiery sunset, her presence a silent question. He looked up, his heart a hesitant drum in his chest. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he offered, his voice a low murmur. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," she agreed, her voice quiet, almost brittle, like the calm after a storm. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps acceptance. The years of resentment, of unspoken accusation,